Welcome to Natural 2. It's our unscripted D&D and tabletop role-playing game talk show and podcast. Kind of the same thing, but
Mhm.
I am James, and just a little bit of background. I've been playing D&D for since 2007, 2006,
It's respectable.
something like that. I was playing other similar kinds of games before then, and trying to get into a D&D game for a while.
Mhm.
So suffice to say, I've been playing for a long time, and I'm into it enough that I'm now on this show trying to talk about it on the internet.
Fair enough.
And my fellow talk show host here is...
I'm Nathan. I've been interested in D&D basically since I was a young lad, but really have only been seriously playing it in the past 2 or 3 years or so, but it's been quite the adamant obsession during that time period, so I think I've probably achieved a lot more D&D play than most people have in a similar time extent. So, yeah, now I find myself also on this talk show giving advice that sometimes lands and doesn't land. But yeah, today we are going to be discussing D&D as a whole and kind of introducing it to people that are not familiar with it, or perhaps challenging some opinions on D&D or tabletop role-playing to be more specific. And yeah, just kind of offering some different points and kind of inviting you into the fold of this weird little hobby or niche or corner of the internet that we all reside in.
If you've seen any of our other videos, you might be wondering why the extended introductions, and that is the reason. We hope that if all goes well, if all goes as intended, that there will be some folks who are totally new to the whole endeavor that are seeing this for the very first time.
Well,
So,
as the title of the video says, send this to people that are not familiar with D&D or are detractors of D&D. So if you fit into that category and have been sent this video, then it is fulfilling its purpose. And hopefully the first part of the video is going to be covering kind of what D&D is as a whole. So if that's not something that interests you, then there will certainly be timestamps down in the description below to peruse at your pleasure.
so welcome. And without further ado, what is D&D? That's a tougher question to answer for us that have been steeped in it than it might seem,
Hmm.
because the reality is that it's a lot of things. It can encapsulate a lot of different kinds of entertainment. The simplest version that I can think is that it is a storytelling game where people gather either around a table in person or online to progress through an imaginary world using dice and rules to see what happens, to decide what happens, as opposed to just sitting there and declaring as though they were writing a story.
Hmm.
There's one person who's in charge of the world. They are playing the environment, and everyone else is a player, and they're in charge of, generally speaking, their one character.
Hmm. No, I've had this conversation with a rather large spectrum of people, whether they're older and just haven't really had any interest in this, or they're younger and haven't been exposed to something like tabletop role playing or D&D, which you'll probably find us using somewhat interchangeably in this video, mainly due to the fact that D&D is the kind of monopolized tabletop role playing game that the vast majority of people are going to be referring to. But the easiest thing I've found to kind of offer up to people that are fully unfamiliar with what we do is almost subscribing it to an improv class or like an improv practice. And if you're not familiar with that, maybe even the show like Whose Line Is It Anyway is a somewhat good source to pull from. The base transaction is somewhat similar of there are people on a stage or a group that's like all working together that are getting different bits of stimulus kind of thrown their way. You know, they're being told they're a plumber or they're a man running down a street or there's someone holding a heavy object, and then they are kind of tasked with embodying that person and portraying it and fleshing it out and interacting with the others in that area. And the only real addition is that D&D has rules that we follow and mechanics and a whole little community built up around it. And then you wrap it all up in a story bow where each session after the next makes some sort of cohesive story that everyone contributes to. And that's more or less how I usually try to introduce it. The first thing that everyone asks is how do you win or who wins, and kind of traditional game board stuff, and that's something you kind of have to push back against because really there is no winning in D&D. There really isn't any losing in D&D either. It's more just we're telling a story and see where it goes.
I would compare it to a serialized sort of TV show.
Mhm.
That's where my mind always goes. So every week or couple of weeks or whatever time frame the group is playing on, they get together and play out the next part of the story that they are in. And I like the comparison to improv as well, except that instead of plumbers or funny characters at a party, you are usually monster hunters in a fantastical sort of medieval setting. If you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies, if you've seen Game of Thrones, if you've seen perhaps the Dungeons and Dragons movie that recently came out, then you've got an idea for the flavor, for the sort of genre that these things tend to have.
Mhm. The one of the more interesting questions I usually get when I bring up that I play D&D, and more specifically that I like run the game or I'm the dungeon master, which you always get a little bit of side eye when you're like, oh, you're the dungeon master, eh? The more politically correct term that you can use is game master, and no one will give you that kind of strange look in the eye. But anyway, a question I often receive is, where do you get this stuff? How does the story progress? Like, how do you decide what happens? And like, I don't, that's never been a challenge to me of understanding that it's all just imagination, creativity, and kind of on the spot development. So I'll show them things like the world that I'm crafting for the players to run around in, and the cities they explore, and the people they meet. And they'll ask the same question of, but how do you figure that out? It's like you make it up and then you keep going. And really, the only restriction, and this is more specifically referring to things called homebrew, where you are crafting content by yourself for your group. There is like official material where you can buy pre-packaged quests that you can flip through, and there are already pre-built NPCs and worlds and locations that you go one to the next to the next. But I much prefer building my own thing because it allows me the most creativity. So that's a concept that I didn't think was hard to wrap your head around, but I have seen people not be able to, of all of our stuff's made up. It's all just between us. It's like a weird, really complicated secret handshake that we have of knowing the deep lore of this fantasy world that doesn't exist except between the 4 or 5 of us. So
Something about getting a group of people like-minded together on the same wavelength. Once the ball is rolling, that stuff also comes pretty easily and pretty quickly. It's surprising how natural it can start to seem when you've got a good group that's playing off of each other's ideas and throwing things out there and able to pick up the slack when somebody else is without words. So before we go any farther, I also want to do my due diligence here. Dungeons and Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game. Some folks who are unfamiliar might call everything Dungeons and Dragons, but it's just the biggest one. It's like calling every tissue a Kleenex or calling every video game system a Nintendo. It's a tabletop role playing game
Mhm.
that was first authored by a man named Gary Gygax in the late 70s,
Yeah, was it
I believe.
73 is when the first edition came out?
Was it? Okay. So in the 70s. So it's been around for a minute. And it's had a long and winding history
Hmm.
that we're not going to cover right now. Maybe not ever.
Hmm.
We'll see. But uh, just to drop the names, give the propers, uh, give that little bit of technical background.
Hmm. Kind of piggybacking off of that and into our next little, I guess, segment, I suppose, is D&D, and again, tabletop role-playing games as a whole, has changed and warped and adjusted and grown as a community or a subset of people over the ages. I obviously don't have any first-hand accounts of playing back in the 80s because I wasn't born yet, but obviously there was like the Satanic Panic, and there's been rises and fall in D&D popularity, and we've now kind of hit a new resurgence of tabletop role-playing games, especially following COVID. There is a lot of people stuck in their homes looking for online games where you play through a video call, much like this. And now it's probably the most popular it's ever been, as far as I'm aware. And it's pretty in the scope of, I guess, normal discourse, a lot more than it used to be. So, the one thing I kind of wanted to bring up is that it's not the Stranger Things aesthetic that a lot of people kind of picture when they picture D&D, of like four nerdy guys in their basement sitting on milk crates, like throwing around dice, screaming about the Demigorgon being slain. Like, sometimes it is that, and there certainly are people that thrive to or strive to be in that situation, but more often than not, I think the community or the hobby as a whole has kind of developed to be a bit more modern. It very much fulfills a lot of the same social needs as like hanging out at a party every weekend, or going to a concert, or playing a sport every week with a group of friends. It is that core weekly ritual of I have my dudes, I have my friends, I have my group, and we all get together, we do this thing that we all care about and we're invested in, and we all feed off of that social energy. It's a very healthy release without trying to sound too much like a car salesman. It is something that I have found really important to me because it's an outlet for me to get out of my shell because I live in a cave. It allows me to explore interesting concepts and worlds and people because you kind of have to when creating a whole world for your players to run around in. So it's not what people tend to kind of box it into as far as a stereotype is. It very much is this new, interesting, fantastical world. It sounds like I'm selling drugs to people, but it really is like an astounding and important aspect of my life that I almost need at this point. It is my main source of socializing with like-minded people. So that's at least somewhat of a, hopefully, a hint of what it is outside of the like, oh, I did 37 damage with my +1 flaming sword. Do I save the princess? Because I think that's what a lot of people still picture, which is kind of strange.
All kinds of people play. I've come across many different types of persons. I've come across the entire spectrum of ages. You know, it's not just for children, uh, and it's not just for adults. The the group is in control of what the content of their game is, uh, and who they feel like their group is for, and it's got a lot in common with a weekly card game night, or getting together for a movie night, or anything like that. It is an activity to gather people around it. And I said in one of our early videos, talked in one of our early videos, that we are in a time where our society is experiencing an epidemic of loneliness. Not to get too dire or serious right now, but it's just facts.
Mm-mm.
It's a social activity, like you said, to gather like-minded people around, and you play by talking. So it's got a lot going for it in that regard.
Mhm. So I guess I want to start, I guess, at least talking about a few of the things that people bring up as far as like being a detractor of D&D or mocking D&D in some way. I don't honestly run into too much of it nowadays, but there is little pockets of it here and there. The Probably the biggest one I interact with, and it even is kind of part of the D&D community, join in on this as well, is making fun or kind of belittling people getting really invested into a hobby or a game such as this, whether they're saying like, oh, you're way too attached to your fake imaginary character and you shouldn't really put real emotions into that. That's really weird. That's creepy. Like, what are you trying to do? Or it's kind of along the same vein of people making fun of the escapism of it, of finding yourself needing that release to step into a different world and escape our own because, our own has some issues going on more often than not. So those are things that I see, again, both within the community and outside the community, of people looking at some of the more, I don't want to say vulnerable, but the more bought in or serious players, that I'm not thinking of the right term right now, that really cherish their game and find a lot of benefits from it and a lot of insight from it, and then making fun of that, which I find really strange because if a hobby is bringing joy to someone and fulfilling them and adding good things to their life, then you really shouldn't belittle it, especially if it's not harming anybody else. But that is the nature of the beast in a lot of different areas. People will like to poke and jab and all that kind of stuff. So.
I I will simply my contribution to this portion of the discussion will be a handful of rhetorical questions. Have you ever known anyone who did Civil War reenactments?
Mhm.
And what were they like on that weekend? And how much work did they put into their regalia?
Mhm.
Have you ever known someone who was super into their football team and had a lucky pair of clothing that they would wear on game day because if they weren't, their team would lose?
Mhm.
Have you ever known someone who had a project car and worked on it in the garage? And how do you think they would feel if one of the wheels got curbed?
Mhm. No, I mean
Uh,
it's very much that. Like, there is so many examples in our society of people putting a ton of effort into the things they love, and if the thing you love is D&D and you find yourself going down that rabbit hole, it's no different. I mean, it is different, but it's not any worse than any of the other examples.
we're more alike than we are different
Hmm.
as a people, as
Hmm.
Earthlings. Words to live by.
Hmm.
But let's also address, because it's actually been relatively recently that I've still seen some people bring it up. Is D&D devil worship? Is it satanic? Is it sacrilegious?
Hmm.
Now, I'm not going to go into my personal spirituality, and I also am not a reverend or a preacher or a priest or in any way, formally educated in that
Hmm.
realm. But it doesn't intersect with my spiritual life. And in playing for almost 20 years now, holy crap, uh, I have not come across anyone for whom it does.
Hmm.
Uh, it's there's no real there's no reality in this fantasy. Uh, it it is not it is not satanic. Uh, that name doesn't really ever come up. It is not related to religion in our. It is not related to any real religion in any way, except for borrowing some imagery,
Hmm.
which so does everything. Um, everything, all fiction, all television, all movies borrow heavily from religious imagery without being explicitly religious or referencing those texts or those beliefs. We don't think that we're really casting magic. These are not rituals or spells that are in any way meant to affect our real world around us. It's
Mhm.
in this respect, it's just a game.
Mhm.
No more than people playing chess believe that they've actually killed a queen or a king.
Mhm.
Uh, so relax.
I've always struggled to actually even take that topic seriously. Like, obviously, it was a big deal because, again, everyone who's in the hobby is aware of the satanic panic, and you can read 1,000 stories about parents burning their children's books and all this kind of stuff. So it's a very real thing and a very serious thing that a lot of people took part in and took very seriously. But currently, it's just so hard for me to wrap my head around it, and probably because I'm fairly far removed from any sort of traditional religious aura. I'm not part of a church or a sect or anything of that nature. So it's just not really even there for me to be worried about that. And I've read different, I guess, kind of like current posts or whatnot on like, Reddit and forums of players coming to games and being like, oh, I don't want my guy to be religious because realistically there's only one God. I don't want to like pray to any false god. And the DM's like, you do realize this is a game, right? Like, you're not actually worshiping this fake god in this fake game. Like, it's just symbology or even like a mechanic. Like, we don't have to put any effort into this at all. And that is just, I think it really only comes from people that hold that belief so strongly that it has to dominate how they interact with anything in that ballpark. If they interact with someone who isn't religious, they then have to bring it up. If they interact with a different religion than theirs, they have to bring it up. And so they just kind of bring that energy into D&D, which, I guess isn't wrong if that's how you function, but that isn't the purpose of why we're sitting down to play. Kind of what you were talking about is there's a ton of culturally accepted norms of like symbology in D&D of like, there's hell in D&D where, there's hell in our most popular religion in our real world, and it's not the same. We're not trying to reference it or worship it or try and give it more emphasis than it actually is. It's just something that we as a people use to express a certain emotion or theme or something of that nature. So that's like, I think the most that it ever matters is it's just referencing things that are almost like languages that we have to use to communicate with one another.
I like the TV show example again for this because you're on your watching your favorite cop show, they're not really cops.
Mhm.
They know that they're not really cops. It's just something that we've all agreed to play along with for the fun of it.
Mhm.
But we know that nobody's really been murdered. Nobody's really getting arrested. It's just a story. And that's basically the same thing.
And I bet you every cop that watches the fake cop show goes, wow, they have no idea what it's like to be a cop.
Yeah. Yeah, that too. If I think that's one of the reasons for playing in a medieval fantasy setting is that you don't have that.
Mhm.
There are no players that are really from the medieval fantasy world that are going to say that's not how that works.
There
So
is a
it gives you liberty to do what you want.
The kind of tail end of this is also, we mentioned earlier that your group controls the content of what you're playing, whether you're playing D&D or a different system entirely. You could be space hopping from one strange world to the next and not even reference religion at all. You could play a deeply religious game where gods and Greek mythology and various titans and like all these kind of real world influences are coming in. You could play a present day game where it's eldritch horror popping up and you're, going around solving mystery. Like, there is, when someone says something like, oh, D&D is evil, D&D satanic, it's pulling people into these evil forces, it's like, I don't even understand that claim. That doesn't follow, that doesn't track. If you really understand what you're talking about, then that claim, that sentence doesn't make sense because it's way too broad.
So honestly, we've probably devoted more time to this than it really warrants. But
Yeah.
I I have seen, as I said, I have seen within the last year
Mhm.
people looking for advice online because their parents or their family or someone in their life still feels that way about it.
Mhm.
Still finds it frightening. So that was our attempt at trying to address it.
Yeah, we're a bit rambly here. We don't always hit the nail on the head, but we usually at least leave a bunch of hammer marks around it, so that's something.
What's our wrap up here, my friend?
I think I will pose a question to you, and then potentially I'll answer it depending on how well you state it. How would you invite someone to try D&D who has never been interested in it before? And this is like potentially the first video they've ever been sent, or they have a friend, a son, a boyfriend, or whoever that's interested in it and trying to get them into it. What would be, I guess, like your sales pitch or your how to dip your toe into the water?
So there's never been a better time to get started because if you live in an area that is even just a medium population, there's probably people playing near you. If that doesn't work for you, there are many, many, many people playing online like we do. And across the board, people involved in this hobby are excited to help new people, to get them started, to help them uh, have fun with it, to accept them into the group. There's no need to be nervous or feel like you're going to embarrass yourself. Um, it's a very welcoming community in my experience. And it doesn't take a lot. If you can do simple addition, you can play. You don't have to get super in character. You don't have to be like the Civil War reenactor guy. You don't have to be that deep to play. Really, all it takes is just a willingness to show up and do some simple math.
Hmm.
Uh, Chances are, whoever you find to play with is gonna be happy to offer you anything you might need to use. The book to look at, to get going, dice to borrow, and they really will just be happy for you to be there.
I think my only addition to that is it's probably somewhat unrealistic to expect everyone who has a vague interest or even have just heard about it and want to know more to play the actual game. I would highly recommend that even if you are just being sent this video so that you understand maybe your significant other's favorite hobby or something, just dabble in it. Maybe make a character or watch perhaps like a live play podcast of it or watch more content around it. It doesn't, you don't have to commit to playing with a group or playing every week or getting in the weeds or really diving all the way in. As long as you just kind of toy with the various aspects of it and kind of appreciate the different pieces that come together to make the whole, I think that is at least one step towards kind of understanding and having a better respect for it, I suppose. So that would be my recommendation is if you're vaguely interested in it, don't feel pressured to have to be interested in it. Just poke around, read about it, learn about it, watch about it. The internet is full of absolutely every single resource you could ever need at this point, so use that to your advantage.
The basic rules are free to download. You don't have to buy any books
Mhm.
in order to make a basic table ready character.
Mhm.
If you put D&D basic rules in your favorite search engine, you'll find them. But maybe there'll also be a link in the description. Uh, we'll see.
Mhm.
And um, there's a ton of content online from videos like ours where we discuss topics about the hobby to people actually playing, I will caution you about watching video of people playing only because uh, D&D groups can be as varied as the people that are in them.
Mm-hmm.
And if a group is dedicated enough to put cameras on themselves and play, they're going to be closer to the Civil War reenactor end of the spectrum. Uh, don't feel like you need to copy them.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Yeah. I think that's about it. Everyone respect your various hobbies and whatnot, people's interests, and again, unless it's very detrimental to somebody else, I think that's the one golden standard there. D&D is something that is now a very strong part of my life. It's probably never going to leave, so I do have a bit of a biased attachment to it, so come at me if you need to. But yeah, that's about all I got.
Any questions? Put them in the comments. We or someone else will be very glad to try to answer that for you. And hopefully you will feel edified to the point that you might like and subscribe.
There it is.
Hey, that's small price to pay, in my opinion.
No price to pay, I suppose.
At any rate, hopefully this is helpful and maybe gets your interest peaked. And if that's the case, we'll be back next week with another video with a topic about this hobby.
Perhaps with the small pebble that causes the avalanche. Some, I don't know, out there fake insightful hotel lobby quote.
Yeah, why not? We're about positivity today.
Uh-huh. As always.
It takes work, it's not automatic, but gosh darn it. Gotta put the vibes out there.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's all for now.
Have a good one.